Hello there, Hayden here from FowlsOnFantasy.com, and today we're going to be talking about the basics of sculpting. Sculpting in Blender is really great because it allows us to create really organic topology quite quickly. So here's an example of some trees that I made a while back. And Blender's got some great tools and some easy shortcuts which allows us to speed up our workflow. So let's get started. There is a key prompt below just to help you follow along. In order to create a mesh, we're going to press Shift A, and then I'm going to go down to the drop down menu and press Cube, and this is what we should have. Now we can't go and sculpt on this automatically as it is, but if we want to go to the sculpt mode, we just go to that drop down menu there and press sculpt mode. And sculpting mode is the mode that we're going to be focusing on. Upon changing to sculpting mode, you should get this menu here. If you do not have it, you can press T to bring it up. Just remember T for toolbar. You may have seen some other videos where the sculptor is using a really nice material. To get that, we're just going to check matte cap here, which is under display. And then we can just choose our matte cap. This one seems pretty good. If you do not have this menu, you can press N to bring it up. Or alternatively, you can press the plus on the side of the screen. Now I'm going to make this cube easier to use, so I'm going to subdivide it. So I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode while the cube is selected. And then after that, I'm going to press W and press Subdivide Smooth. And there we go, a much more useful object. We can give our object smooth shading in the shading parameters in the toolbar. Just go down to here and press Smooth. And as you can see, we no longer have the harsh geometric lines. So now let's go back to sculpt mode. Now sculpting is literally us just manipulating the geometry. So we have a certain set of tool sets, and by using these tools we can affect the geometry. Now there are two main ways of sculpting in Blender. First, and my favorite, is dynamic topology, and the other is multi-resolution. Both have their pros and cons. I would say multi-resolution is a much better option if you're developing models for games. However, it comes with the drawback of being very hardware intensive. Dynamic topology, on the other hand, is a lot more messy, but it gives you geometry where you need it and when you need it. Both are really good methods and both have their uses. So let's look at dynamic topology. So in order to enable dynamic topology, we have to select it here. Now we can also do this by pressing Ctrl D. When we do this, you'll notice that our model loses its smooth shading. To reapply, just press smooth shading in the drop down menu of Dynotopo. Let me visualize what I said about mesh where you need it, when you need it. As you can see, when I apply my brush to this mesh, it subdivides it where I'm brushing, creating more detail for me to use. By default, dynamic topology is set to affect our mesh in a relative fashion. I'll show you an example of that. If I zoom in with my mouse, the detail that is created is much finer. Now if I change this from relative to constant, we'll see a change. Now when I zoom in, it will not create finer detail but will stay at a constant rate. Both of these have their uses. I personally prefer leaving it on relative. Next, let's have a look at the multi-resolution workflow. I'm going to go back to object mode and just reset the scene. So subdividing, smoothing, and now instead of going to dynamic topology, we're going to go to the modifiers tab and we're going to pick multi-resolution. Multi-resolution essentially works by enabling you to create higher levels of detail through the order of subdivision. We gain these levels by pressing subdivide in the modifier menu. Once done, I can go back to sculpt mode, and then as you can see, there is no change in topology and it is quite clean. If we try and enable Dyno topology, it will give us a warning. This is where the downside of this workflow comes into play. Because we're bound by the level, if we want to create a mesh of higher level of detail, we have to subdivide by another order of magnitude. But this is also where the strength comes into play. If we go down on our levels, our modifications on the higher levels will be transferred down to them, except on the base level, but we can apply this by pressing Apply Base. As you can see, our modifications from our highest level have now been applied to the lowest level. Let me go back to sculpt mode and create some more detail so I can showcase this ability in a more drastic fashion. My masterpiece is now complete. So now I'm just going to apply the base, and we'll see that these modifications are now transferred to the lowest subdivision. Now I know this may not look like much, but this workflow has a lot of power behind it, just as the dynamic topology one does. And both, it's really important, both have their pros and cons. One thing that you may want to do while sculpting is to sculpt something that's not mirrored. So you can just do this by going to the symmetry dropdown and then unchecking any mirror if there is one on. So in this case I turned off X and now I'm going to turn on Y, and as you can see it changes the mirror and how my sculpt is applied to the mesh. This is useful when you're sculpting non-uniform objects. Another really useful thing when you're sculpting is a clean workspace. One way that we can declutter our workspace is by pressing N and then going down to display and then check only render. This will remove everything other than your model and what's going to be rendered on screen. Now while I make this rather not so masterful piece in the background, I'm going to go over some key shortcuts just to get you going. So the one that I'm using now is the crease brush, and you can get to that by pressing Shift C. This is really great for those high detail areas and really getting in there and making some really nice things. You may also notice that I'm sometimes inverting that brush. You can do that by holding Control. Now I'm going to select the grab brush, remember G for grab, and there you may have seen I'm changing the size. I can do that by pressing F, and then I can change the strength by pressing Shift F. When you see me smoothing out my brush strokes, all that I'm doing is holding Shift, and that's all you have to do, and it enables your smooth brush. If you're not using a numpad emulator, pressing 3 will give you the clay strips. This is a great brush for building up form. And lastly, K. This will give you the snake hook brush. If you increase the rake, is that it will affect how much it follows the rotation of the cursor. This is great for creating tails or ears or anything really that has to protrude from the mesh. I'm going to create some very fancy bunny ears with it. And last but not least, I'd like to just give a little mention to one of the most important elements of all of this, and that's planning. As that saying goes, if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. Even if it's just a little sketch, it's going to serve you exponentially. So, that wraps up this basic overview of sculpting in Blender. I've hoped you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you've learned something, please give this a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you very much. This is Hayden Falsom from falsonfantasy.com signing off.